Hello, and thank you for joining us for the 14th episode of The Agenda. I'm Gia Drew. I'm the program director at Equality Maine, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers.
And I'm Jake Karras. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the grassroots advocacy coordinator here at Equality Maine.
Glad you're with us today, Jake. We are live, so whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, please say hello in the chat and let us know where you are watching from. I am coming to you live from my office in Kennebunkport. Also, also, as we go, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and one of our staff members will get to it on Zoom. And a special thanks to our ASL interpreter, Meryl. Thank you. Today, I'm joined by Quinn Gormley, Executive Director at the Maine Transgender Network. Both Equality Maine and MaineTransNet have been working tirelessly to defeat some pretty horrible bills in Augusta. So welcome, Quinn.
Nice to be back, Gia.
So before we talk about the very big news this week, there has been some other things happening around the country that I just want to touch on briefly. So, of course, we had the biggest hearings of the session yesterday, but across the country, there's also something that we're really keeping a close eye on, and that is a federal court case called Heckox v. Little. This is the case that was brought by the ACLU and a feminist legal organization called Legal Voice that challenged the initial sports bill that came up in Idaho last year. So this was the initial lawsuit that really set the stage for what we're seeing now. So on Monday of this week, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals heard oral arguments in this case. And we expect this case to be pretty significant in what happens next, at least as far as the law is concerned.
Yeah, I'm paying attention. I don't know what's gonna happen in the Supreme Court, but it's really important. So yesterday, if you've been following along, we had multiple hearings on multiple bills that were attacking the trans community and attacking other marginalized community members. So I think Quinn and I are going to talk a little bit about first the first two bills, which were really about transgender athletes in sports. So Quinn, do you want to get us started talking about what the bills are, what their names are, and who their sponsors are?
Yeah, absolutely. So the sports bills were heard together yesterday, which we are certainly thankful for. We didn't have to sit through 2 rounds of attacks against our community. So they're LD 926, which is sponsored by Representative Beth O'Connor of Berwick, and LD 1401, which is sponsored by Representative Kinney of Knox. And they both concern the ability for trans girls and women to participate in gender segregated sports within public schools in Maine.
I'm muted. There you go. It was a long day. There was a third bill, and the third bill, which came after those two, was LD 1238, an act to protect women's single-sex shelters, sponsored by Senator Keim of Oxford. And so the entire day really focused on the human rights and dignity of transgender people, specifically transgender girls and women. So I'd like to talk first about the morning, which was the first 4 or 5 hours, which we spent most of the time talking about the anti-trans sport bills. Quinn, who were some of the folks who stepped up to testify in opposition to these bills?
Yeah, so I gotta say, there was a lot of really ugly stuff that got said yesterday, but trying to come down after the end of 8 hours of hearing, I was holding on to some really beautiful things that happened. And I think up there for me was sort of our first 10 opposition testifiers or so were made up primarily of young people and the parents of trans young people. So there were transgender student athletes who sort of kicked off our testimony, speaking about how this would particularly impact their ability to participate in their lives fully. We heard from cisgender girls who were student athletes talking about their desire to share their teams and their space with trans girls so that they can be part of the team too. We heard from student leaders. We heard from the Brunswick Civil Rights team. We heard from the senior class president from Freiburg Academy, talking about how they're trying to improve their school culture and how inclusion is an important part of that. And they felt that these bills were in counter to those goals. And of course, we heard from parents who talked about how sports are, one of those places where their kids can be strong, which is important for trans youth in a world that's gonna really get them down frequently, that they have a place where they can learn to embrace themselves and learn to persevere through challenging times.
Yeah, thank you for lifting up some of the really positive and powerful testimony in opposition to these dangerous and very hurtful bills. As Quinn, and I agree with Quinn, some of the language that we heard yesterday was really hard to hear. And so if you're curious and you are going to be going to watch some of these videos, and they are available, the testimony is available on YouTube, just beware that it was hard to sit through, hard to hear, and take good care of yourself if you are going to be sitting through some of the testimony, because some of the proponents of these bills are ignorant to what it's like to be trans, what the lived experience is of transgender girls and young people are. And so just be forewarned. Some of the testimony is pretty ugly. Just to get people up to speed a little bit of what the situation is here in Maine, if you haven't been paying attention, transgender athletes, especially in schools in the state of Maine, have been allowed to participate in school sports for nearly a decade, or maybe even more now. The MPA, the Maine Principals Association, developed a policy 10 or 11 years ago that would allow transgender youth to participate in school sports. And that seems to be working right now. And there hasn't been any problems with transgender athletes, and there hasn't been any complaints from cisgender athletes as well in that entire time. And so I think it was really telling yesterday to see that the majority of people who came and testified in support of these bills, other than the sponsors themselves, were from out of state. They were from people from different states, different parts of the country, representing different factions, as this is the national movement. And so I think seeing so many, I think it was probably 5-1 of people opposed to the bill, and in contrast to those in support of it. And so I think that really lifted my spirits to see how many different people from different groups took the time to write in testimony, or took the time to sit through and wait to be called on and to be heard yesterday. I think the hearing in the morning took at least 4 or 5 hours to hear from people. In addition to young people, which was so empowering, we also had the backing of the groups that sort of oversee sports. The president of the UMaine system spoke up in great, powerful opposition to these bills. The commissioner of education chimed in, speaking for the governor in opposition to these bills. And so I think in the end, it'll be a really, really tall mountain for these bills to go anywhere in the future. And so I feel really good now, looking back. In the moment, it's kind of scary when people were saying really horrible things. But today, looking back, I think we're in a much better place. What do you think, Quinn?
Yeah, it was really promising to see the sort of institutional opposition as well. I think we also had the Attorney General there at one point. So yeah, and I think going into this, we've been optimistic since we knew about these bills that we could defeat them right now, and yet that also doesn't negate the harm of the fact that another generation of queer kids now know what it feels like to have their existence debated by their elected officials. And I think that does real harm, even when we are able to more confidently than ever defeat attacks in our community. They are still attacks.
Absolutely. And I think for those folks who are newer to the political process, it is messy. It can be very ugly behind the scenes, and this was very public, but that is the process that we live in. And so I really want to applaud the people who stepped up and wrote in testimony and chose to voice their support in opposition to these bills. I think Jake is going to give us a little background, because this is not just happening here in Maine. What's going on in the national scene, Jake?
Thanks, Gia. Your point earlier, I want to come back to that the Maine Principals Association has had a policy on the books for 8 years now. And I mentioned that because some of the supporters of the bill suggested that this is a recent trend that trans athletes are playing sports, when in reality they have it reversed, that the latest attacks on the community are the latest in thing, and that the participation is actually the norm. So that's something that we're seeing really across the country. Now, to be clear, we knew that these bills were coming late last year when the bill titles became available. We could surmise from the titles of the bills that these were not going to be particularly friendly pieces of legislation. But it happened at a fortunate time in our season here in Maine that a lot of the other states facing these already had hearings and legislative action. So we sort of had an idea as to how this would play out. And one of the common trends that we have seen is that the groups that are really, really adamant about pushing this legislation show up all over the country. And that happened yesterday too. We had folks, like Gia said, from I believe 4 or 5 states. I made note of South Carolina, Minnesota, Connecticut, and Nebraska all showed up to a Maine hearing. Again, so they're advocating for policies that have no effect on them, but they still decide to show up to Maine hearings, which is really solid evidence that this is a very national and very coordinated trend to try to push this legislation. And to be clear, like I said earlier, with the pending case in federal court, there's really no certainty as to whether these are even going to survive a legal challenge. The 5 states that did pass these bills this session, unfortunately, may see those reversed before they're even implemented, pending a possible court decision. So I don't want I don't want that to lessen the fact that it's still just as harmful to see people's rights to participate and to exist in public fall by the wayside. But I do take a little bit of optimism knowing that the courts do not seem at all likely to side on to take the side of the states that have already moved in this direction.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think the sports bills are getting a lot of the attention across the country and here in Maine. But I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the other anti-trans bills that are happening across the country and here in Maine. And so specifically, there've been some really draconian bills that would prohibit doctors from supporting transgender youth in their transition in a couple of places across the country, and those are just really dangerous. And here in Maine, we have a bill that would change the status of shelters for women. And here in Maine, that bill actually originally was labeled an anti-trans bill, and it still is an anti-trans bill, but they changed the language when the bill got printed to really attack all folks in protected classes. And so that bill was also heard yesterday, and it isn't getting as much attention, but it was a pretty intense afternoon, Quinn, yesterday when we got to testify and hear the testimony on shelters. Do you want to give us a little update on what that was like?
Yeah, absolutely. So that one was LNE 1238, which is the Senator Kimes bill, which we were talking after the hearing, Gia, about how although a lot of yesterday was ugly, I feel like the real vitriolic stuff came out in the debate around this bill, perhaps because we were talking about adults, perhaps because we were talking about abuse and violence. But so that this bill was designed to make it so that single-sex shelters, so domestic violence shelters, homeless shelters, could legally deny services to transgender women and girls. And to accomplish that, they just attempted to exempt those shelters from the Maine Human Rights Act, which would exempt them from all non-discrimination against any marginalized community that's protected under the Maine Human Rights Act. But the focus of the hearing was on specifically on trans women. And these are deeply concerning to us because we know that trans people and trans women in particular have a really vested interest in these spaces because we have exceptionally high experiences of homelessness and domestic abuse that cause us to need these shelter services. And that we're already struggling to access these spaces. These spaces, even from among some of the groups that testified on our side yesterday, who are with us in theory are not always with us in practice, even in a progressive state like Maine, even with wonderful organizations doing amazing work against abuse across our state. So, we were deeply concerned about it. I think rhetorically, there was a lot of the coming back to referring to transgender women as biological males, and that started first thing in the morning yesterday, but it was really telling to me that Senator Kimes' testimony introducing the bill, right at the beginning of her second or third paragraph, was transgender women are not women. And it really deteriorated from that point on. And so I haven't witnessed that level of directed attack in a public hearing in recent time against LGBTQ people. And I think it's just really important to know that what we're seeing in Maine, what we're seeing nationally, is sort of this focus specifically on trans women and girls, rather than the whole trans community, because there's just more stereotypes. And we heard every single one of them about trans women yesterday, that we are bigger, that we are men in dresses, that we are predators of some kind, when in reality, we are stakeholders in these spaces, and we are frequently survivors and victims who need these services. So, a couple of other things that are concerning to us from this too is, we saw some interesting allegiances from our opposition and who was proposing these bills, and that we saw sort of the conservative, traditionally anti-queer, anti-trans elected officials supporting these bills, and then we saw people purporting to be, progressive feminists coming at us for these bills under the suggestion that we were threatening hard-won women's rights by simply participating as women in women's spaces. And that's concerning. We're increasingly seeing in Maine and across the country that this partnership between social conservatives and trans exclusionary feminists that makes their points sound a lot more reasonable than they actually are. And I think that's, even as we defeat this bill, I think that is damaging and concerning.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Quinn, because that's something that's been on my radar. If you're ever on Twitter like I am, you're probably going to see a ton of language and attacks. And it really is a concerted effort to divide communities, especially women, on issues like trans human rights. And we definitely heard that yesterday for sure, related to the attacks that trans women aren't women at all. And I think that goes to the heart of both of the issues related to sports and with the shelters. And that's been around, like you mentioned, for decades. The fact that we are somehow not who we say we are. And
I think particularly whereas with the sports issues, this is a relatively new debate, even though trans people in sports are not new. The shelter debates and the sort of women-specific spaces, that debate is not new to the trans community. That's been going on for decades as well. And these attacks have been very successful in other spaces where you wouldn't expect them to be.
Yeah, that is true. And I think the good thing from the federal government is their support for transgender women to access to shelters. HUD recently announced, their recommitment to support for shelters and for women seeking shelters, which includes trans women seeking shelter. So, I think, again, we're in a place where our state government and our federal government are in alignment and agreement that trans women are women and they deserve access to shelters and women-only shelters as well. But there were lots of small little things that came up in the conversation related to the Maine Human Rights Act, which law covers this, which law covers that. But I think in the end, there were definitely more people opposed to these bills, more institutions opposed to these bills, and the stories, again, that transgender women are more likely to be in harm's way and really need access to shelters did not go lost on me.
It was really telling to me. They're all of the proponents of these bills talking about how women don't want trans women in these spaces. And well, who did we have up first opposing these bills but the Maine Women's Lobby and the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence and Florence House Women's Shelter? Yeah. The people actually engaged in this work want trans women in these spaces and are on our side.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a long day, and there's definitely more going on. And, we'll be paying attention to where these bills move as they move slowly through the process. For those of you following along with the legislative process, there'll probably be something called a work session in the next week or so for the representatives and senators on the committee to think deeply about these bills. And then eventually, probably in 2 weeks or so, there'll be votes in those committees, and then it will move on from there to the full House for votes. And so please stay tuned. There's more to come for sure. Both our organizations and many others have been working really hard to defeat these bills. So in addition to MaineTransNet and Equality Maine, we've been working really closely with our friends at GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders GLAD, the Maine Women's Lobby, ACLU Maine. Is that the core of them? I hope I didn't miss anybody there, because that's pretty much the core. So that's really good. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can register at a phone bank. We're calling our friends across the state and encouraging them to contact their legislators. There'll be a link in the chat where you can register to sign up for a phone bank. You'll get trained, you'll get all the information, and you're only calling supporters of Equality Maine and MaineTransNet and asking those folks to go and call your representatives and senators. So please take the opportunity and volunteer to phone bank. It really does make a difference in the state of Maine for people to call their representatives directly. They do listen. We're a really small state, and so it really does make a difference to reach out directly to your representative and senator. We're also keeping an eye on another hearing happening today, LD 1550, which would end the sale of flavored tobacco products in Maine. It's being heard in the Health and Human Services Committee. We'll have an action alert going out next week to our folks to tell their legislators about supporting this bill. So a lot going on here in the state of Maine, especially related to LGBTQ rights. I don't know if I have anything else. Jake, do we have anything else I need to go over?
I don't believe so. Quinn, thanks so much for joining us. And thank you, Meryl, as well, for interpreting, as always.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, great. Quinn, did you want to mention anything about support for trans folks?
I think I would just add, there's been a lot of talk about shelter access need and domestic violence faced by trans people in the news this week. Just a reminder that MaineTransNet provides services directly to transgender survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence. And if that describes you and you'd like some opportunity to connect with other survivors or to find out what your resource options are, you can go to mainetrans.net/survivor and we will get you connected.
Great. Thank you, Quinn. Thanks again for joining us today. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Meryl. Thank you, everyone out there, for supporting our organizations and our work. We are making progress. So thanks again for tuning in for our 14th episode of The Agenda. Have a really good rest of your day and take good care.